Hey everyone, it's Professor Clark, and in this lecture we're going to go very quickly over Soviet history after World War II. While the early years of the Soviet Union were extremely difficult for everyone, the latter part of the Soviet Union, especially in the decades right after World War II, were actually a really great era for a lot of people. It's not that terrible things didn't happen or there weren't struggles and hardships, but things got a lot better for a lot of people. Directly after World War II, society did become more restricted, so there had been a loosening of cultural controls in order to allow artists to help raise morale during the war. That was clamped down on again. But following Stalin's death in 1953, there was a period of liberalization under Nikita Khrushchev, the next general secretary, called the Thaw. And this happened in the 1950s and 1960s. And this thaw included more international travel. So Khrushchev, for example, went and met with various world leaders, but international travel was still restricted for ordinary Soviet citizens, but there was a little bit more. There was a little bit more interaction with people from outside of the Soviet Union. And there was a little bit more freedom of speech. And in particular, there were a number of works describing and criticizing the Gulag and the Great Terror, and the worst of the Stalinist repressions that were published officially and allowed to be disseminated widely and discussed. And this was very exciting. And so for a lot of people, it felt like life was getting better. Economically, the standard of living was rising. There was more freedom, more travel, and people actually had a great feeling of positivity and hope during this period a lot of the time. I decided to devote a whole slide of this very short overview of this period of Soviet history to the Soviet space program for a couple of reasons. One is I found a website with these really awesome propaganda posters for the Soviet space program, and you can see one of them on the slide. The Soviet Union really, really did a fine line in propaganda posters. So I wanted to use some of the posters. But second of all, it's kind of hard for a lot of Westerners to understand why there would be so much Soviet nostalgia, why people would want to return to the days of the Soviet Union, because we only hear about the really bad stuff. But there was also a lot of really good stuff that, especially in hindsight, seems really wonderful. And one of those things was the Soviet space program. And it was the Soviet Union's crown jewel, and it became something of a national religion. I read an article recently about how it sort of took the place of religion, because remember, the Soviet Union was officially atheist. There was no religion because religion is the opiate of the masses. And so they substituted the space program for religion in many ways. And you can see this kind of religious iconography in this poster here, with the cosmonaut holding up the hammer and sickle and the shooting stars in the background that are the various rockets that the space program has put into space. And the caption reads, "Glory to the Soviet people, the pioneer of the cosmos." So in the 1950s through the 1970s, the Soviet Union was definitely a leader in space exploration, and they basically won the space race that was going on between the Soviet Union and the US. And they had a whole series of exciting firsts in space, including the first satellite, the first animal in space, the first human in space, the first woman to go into space, the first spacewalk, the first image of the dark side of the moon, the first interplanetary probes to Venus and Mars, and a whole bunch of other accomplishments. And so they felt very triumphant and powerful, and like they were really doing wonderful things, and that communism was justifying itself by showing the amazing technological and scientific feats that they could achieve by actually going out into space. However, by the late 1970s, things were looking less rosy in the Soviet Union. The economy was stagnating, the standard of living was starting to drop again. society was becoming more repressive, although nothing like the excesses of the Stalinist repressions in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, but nonetheless, it was closing down again after the comparative openness of the Thaw period in the 50s and 60s. And then sort of one of the major blows, the coup de grace, one might even say, was the Soviet-Afghan War of 1979 to 1989. And I wanted to devote a slide to it, in part because it's very important, and in part because there's a lot of talk right now in early 2022 about the current war in Ukraine and how it could turn into a second Afghanistan for Russia, and how this is seen by many Americans as actually a desirable outcome. It's good to know what a second Afghanistan would mean and why people think it might be a good idea, but also why people might think it might be a bad idea. And so in 1979, the Soviet Union brought its military into Afghanistan in support of its pro-Soviet government. And there's a whole bunch of discussion about, was this an invasion or not? They said they were invited by the government, which was true, but the government was kind of a puppet government. So in any case, the Soviet Union entered into Afghanistan with its military in late 1979 and promptly became embroiled in a long-running conflict with the Mujahideen, which were these US-backed Afghan insurgents. This was partially a proxy war between the USSR and the US, so you probably know what a proxy war is, but a proxy war is when there's a war going on. Normally, it's seen as being between the US and Russia or the USSR, but the war itself is being carried on in some third country, and both sides are simply backing two sides of a civil war. And so we could certainly see Ukraine as a proxy war now, and Afghanistan was definitely seen as a proxy war then. And the war was often called Russia's Vietnam. It's also sometimes called the bear trap because supposedly the U.S. tried to sort of engineer it in order to entrap Russia in this and destroy them. And it's considered to be one of the reasons for the collapse of the USSR. It was this long-running, protracted, and more unpopular war that made people very disillusioned with the Soviet Union. So that's to say, it made Soviet citizens more and more disillusioned with the Soviet Union. As I said in the previous slide, by the late 1970s, the Soviet standard of living was stagnating and things were sort of less good overall in the Soviet Union, and it was apparent once again that there was a need for reform. And in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became general secretary and began a program of reforms, which were called perestroika, which means rebuilding, and glasnost, which means something like publicity or free speech. It means, or openness, or it was just generally the idea that there was going to be less censorship and the government was going to be more open about what it was doing. And these reforms were supposed to save the USSR, but they may have in fact led to its dissolution. And in particular, glasnost, while very well-intentioned and probably in some ways necessary, caused a lot of problems because all of a sudden people were hearing about catastrophes that prior to then had been hidden from them. And so it seemed to them that things had suddenly become much, much worse, when in fact they were only a little bit worse. But it seemed like things were just catastrophically worse because now the news was talking about major catastrophes and major problems. And so this was sort of an exciting period, but it was also kind of a dangerous period. And as we will see, led directly to the ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union. So between 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, and 1991, many satellite states broke away from the USSR. So again, the Berlin Wall collapsed. East Germany sort of broke away from the USSR's orbit and was reunited with West Germany. And the Baltic states declared independence, and things were just sort of starting to fall apart. In August 1991, Soviet communist hardliners attempted a coup against Gorbachev, and this led to lots of upheaval. And we see this picture here in the slide is actually Boris Yeltsin, who was then president of the Russian Republic. So remember, the Soviet Union was made up of 15 republics, the largest of which was Russia. And so Boris Yeltsin actually climbed up on a tank that was outside of the Soviet White House, which is its own seat of government in Moscow. He climbed up on this tank and read a proclamation denouncing the coup. So this was sort of his finest hour, and this was like a huge, huge deal. And by December of 1991, things were even worse. And the presidents of Russia, so Boris Yeltsin, along with his counterparts in Ukraine and Belarus, declared that the USSR was being dissolved. They dissolved the USSR and declared it over, and said that all 15 republics were now independent nations. And as you can imagine, after that, things got very exciting.